Let's start then with looking at what Ready for Ageing said. I'll just give you the highlights, although you've got no excuse not to read it. The report's only 10 pages long. There are 100 pages of appendices and evidence, but the report itself is short. It starts obviously with what we know, that we are, each of us, likely to live longer, if we're lucky, than we would have expected. And that's a wonderful gift, the opportunity to have many more years, hopefully, of well-being as well. The second big shift is that there are many more older people, partly because people are living longer, but fundamentally because after the Second World War there was an enormous baby boom. Put those two factors together and you get a quite remarkable surge in the number of people later life. Just to give you a headline figure, you probably know this already, if you take the current decade, the decade that we're 4/10 of the way through now, we'll see nearly a 40% increase in the number of people aged 85 plus. That in itself is a massive social shift. If you look over this decade and the next decade, the number of 85 pluses will double, 100% more people. And if you look at the 65 pluses, you get a similar, if not so dramatic, very significant increase in the number of our older population. And we know that pretty accurately. There's no excuse for denying that or avoiding it. We know it much more accurately than we do any view of what our GDP might be in 5 years' time. And that's relevant to planning. And what Ready for Ageing said was essentially, this is a fantastic social change and opportunity, but unless we as individuals, government at national and local level face up to the changes that we all need to make, we will not maximise the benefit. And of course the answer to the question Ready for Ageing was no, government was woefully underprepared for our ageing society. And by and large, when I talked with ministers in private, I think they accepted that. Let's then look first of all at say a word or two about the Centre for Ageing Better. This is the advert bit. There's always an advert, as you saw earlier in the session. But the Centre for Ageing Better, which I've just become the chair of, and which will launch in 2015, is one of the new work centres, and its role is to synthesise evidence and then vigorously promote that with other partners to try to improve well-being for people in later life. So it's a pretty massive sea of issues, and clearly one of our questions is where we focus. We'll be endowed by the big lottery fund with £50 million in September or October, and we are in the process of building that, organising our trustees and thinking about our strategy and priorities, and you'll see some of that. I'm giving the advert partly because I wouldn't I, but also partly because at certain points I'll make some cross-references to it as we go forward. Let's start, though, with the question about well-being in later life, which I suggested is what we are all about, and that independence is a subset of that. We've got some pretty good understanding from survey data about what makes for well-being. You know it. It's good social relations. It's having a role in society and feeling that you contribute to society. It's having good enough health, or as good health as you can manage in the circumstances, and living in a good neighbourhood. It's very much about having a positive outlook and hopefully being blessed with decent mental health. And adequate income. You don't need to be rich to be happy in later life, but you don't want to have massive shocks either. And then lastly, maintaining independence and control over our own lives as much as is possible given our circumstances. The points I would make on that, and you'll see the reference there, so the source for those, is that how interesting it is that social and psychological factors are at least as important as material ones in terms of making for well-being in later life. And, you know, people like me with a housing and planning background, we don't get rid of our physical determinism, so there's a danger that you think that, you know, mend the roof and that makes for a happy life. It's a bit more complicated than that. And the other point I'd make on that list is that independence is on the list, but it's only one of the factors. So let's assume that this is maximising independence by itself is the right answer to the exam question. What then do we mean by independence? Many older people say that they want to keep independent in later life. And I've not yet found the evidence for drilling down in detail in this, although it's one of our first research topics to try to understand what older people define by well-being and to what extent independence is part of that. In one level, it's a funny thing to say that we want to be independent because, in a sense, the whole point of being human is our interdependence. We get the richness from our lives, from our relationships with friends, families, from work, and that's what makes us human, and that's what gives us pleasure. The thought of the reverse of that, being completely alone and isolated, for most of us is hell. So clearly, when people say they want to be independent, they don't mean that they want to be isolated. And we think that they want to, as far as possible, retain control over their own lives as far as possible. So they don't lose their sense of self, their sense of individuality, their sense of being able to make their own decisions and power and choices as far as is possible. Clearly, as we get older, the risk of becoming dependent increases. And no one is thinking that one can suddenly mean that we retain total independence for all our lives, but it's the rate at which we become dependent and the quality of our dependencies that matter to us. Let's first, though, switch and ask the question, which is a question for you, because you're all young compared to me, and the question for you, in a sense, is how do I prepare to be independent in later life? Because it's not a question you ought to address when you're 65. And again, you know the answer to that because you're experts and I'm not. But clearly, the degree to which we do save sufficiently to support the quality of income that we think is necessary in our later life, the degree to which we adopt lifestyle choices, which will have a significant impact on the degree to which we are healthy and able to be physically mobile, the degree to which we keep active and healthy in our lives and in our work before we retire, the ability to retain our own social relationships, and to have a purpose to life that will transcend when we move beyond what may be full-time work. Clearly, suitable housing and a good neighbourhood are also important, and planning for what sort of housing and neighbourhood we think is appropriate for us in later life. These are not things that you want to start to think about later on, but clearly the big public policy challenge is how do individuals who often do not want to think about when they're in their 20s and 30s start to engage with those issues, and how we motivate them to do so. So how we empower people to live healthier lives is, I think, one of the really impossibly difficult exam questions for the centre, which we have got to engage with. Because the state can't do it, and we can't do it as ourselves if you get to 65 and suddenly address that question. And the last point, I'm not trying to upset you, but maybe I will. Housing is an important part of this, but it has to be seen in context. It isn't just housing professionals thinking about a housing solution is the right way forward. So the centre, when we're up and running, will try to identify and synthesise and generate the relevant evidence to address some of these questions. And then we will be looking, when we've chosen our priorities, to work very actively, probably for 3 or more years, on a particular theme to try to promote that learning and that evidence to bring about change. Because evidence by itself, without having impact, is obviously nice, but not very valuable. That's by way of context. In other words, by saying that independence is important, getting our heads around what it means, but it sits within a wider context of maximising well-being, which I think we shouldn't lose sight of. Let me turn now, just to really bore you rigid, to some of the key data on where we are now, and some of the really significant trends which we've got to get our organisations and ourselves addressing. The key data, the headline stuff, 7 million households led by a person 65 plus, a very large number, and a number that will grow significantly. The second factor which really knocked the socks off me was that 90% of older people live in mainstream housing. The next one, 75% of older person households are owner-occupiers. A remarkable shift from what it would have been 50 years ago, and you know some of the reasons. And low-income older households, 2/3 of them are owner-occupiers. So the view that in some way, because we've got a lot of older people who are owner-occupiers, that means they're all rich, unfortunately is not true. And last, relevant to today, but also in other ways, that only 5% of older people live in specialised housing. It's a remarkably small figure by comparison with many other countries. So that's where we are. If you look at the trends that we are certain are coming, there's going to be a very large increase in the number of older person households, see previous data. over 60, half of all 65-plus households have one or more long-term condition. They will vary in their severity, but that is the fact of later life. It doesn't mean later life is miserable. It means that people learn to live with something that in some ways has a slight limitation or a great limitation on their lives. But that's the reality of getting older for many of us. The really significant issue, though, is the scale of increase in long-term conditions that our society is facing. This was, for me, the most shocking aspect of the House of Lords Select Committee report, that when we asked the Department of Health for their data on what are their forecasts for the increase in long-term conditions, because we know very accurately how many older people there will be, they had not done it. So we had to ask Carol Jagger, one of the most respected I can never say it, will you say it for me? Epidemiologists, to apply current incidence rates to future population sizes to give us a view, not an accurate view, but a view of the scale of increase in long-term conditions, of which dementia is one. And of course that assumes past trends continue, and that's never true, but we're not going to suddenly get instant changes to all of the long-term conditions. Asked her to do on the top 5, I won't tell you what they are, you know what they are. What was staggering was if you take this decade and next decade, the lowest increase in one of those 5 was 45%. The biggest increase was 80%. And if you then look at the increase in the demand for formal social care at the severe level, it was 90%. And if you look at the demand for informal social care, it was even greater. So if you hear nothing else from what I'm droning on about, the fact that we are addressing today's problems, today's challenges, just won't do. We have to make our organisations look at the certain increase in demand and need, as well as the great opportunities that is coming down the track. So that is end of preaching on that one. For these reasons, because most people live in mainstream housing, because there's going to be a lot many more people older, and there's going to be a lot many more people with long-term conditions, how we support independence in people's present homes is a fundamental question, and how do we increase their housing choices to support independence is almost as important. And I'll switch to those two now. Looking then at how to support independence, and I'll just highlight some of the key questions that the Centre, I think, if we look at this issue, will start to ask. The first one is obvious already. If 90% of people live in mainstream housing, the exam question has to be how we support more older people to live with long-term conditions in mainstream housing. We're not, although we need a vast increase in supply, we're not suddenly going to transform the stock of housing over the next 5 or 10 years to suddenly mean that 50% of these additional older households are going to be living in specialised housing. It might be good if it was the case. It cannot possibly happen, so we have to address that question about how we make it work in their own homes. We also know, you know better than I do, that housing and environmental issues are important. Warm homes, accessible, well repaired, safe internally, in a neighbourhood that's good, with good facilities, and it feels safe. These issues matter, and you know that very well. But clearly what I'm saying is we have to do more than that. And if you just address the housing and environmental issues, I think we'll miss the plot. We know that the drivers of independence are that are wider than housing. The preparation and planning, which we talked about previously, keeping healthy, especially mental health, avoiding falls, not being lonely, having good relationships and social support, having access to formal and informal social care, access to information and advice, and sufficient income. We know those. I think the question the Centre will ask, is there evidence of how to improve independence and resilience? And which combination of those factors I've talked about matter most to maximising resilience and maximising independence? In other words, can we get some citing from evidence of which are the really critical factors where we should focus what will always be limited resources? And how do we best make our focus on those issues in a holistic way work? Let's turn then to, I think, the challenge for many of us about what local leadership is needed. Clearly, how we help people maximise their own independence has to be the starting point. The view that in some way that the state at central and local level can do it all for us is obviously both wrong ideologically and completely impracticable. So fundamentally important how at local level we can maximise people's own preparedness and resilience for, and I touched on that previously, and I don't think yet we know the answer to that, but it's critical. The next point I've said already, the planning and preparation to support independence, and as part of that, the assessment locally of their ageing society in their own county, town, community or neighbourhood. We've not yet trawled the evidence, and I hope when we do trawl the evidence I'll be pleasantly surprised. But I'll be surprised if I can find strong strategy statements and analytics by every single local authority in the country and every single health and wellbeing board where they have looked forward to what is the increase in demand that's going to be consequent in their societies and how they think about their strategies to address that. And of course there's no excuse not to do it because the ONS, God bless them, gives us their population projections for local areas. They won't be exactly right because of migration and changing and housing supply itself, but they'll give you some picture of the scale of increase in older population, and you can do your own forecast then relatively easy on the scale of increase in long-term conditions. And therefore you have to have some attention to that at the leader of the council level, at the health and wellbeing board, preferably across the lot, so you know what's going to happen in Wigan, you know what might happen in Tower Hamlets. Otherwise you're just staggering on with the assumption that tomorrow will be like today when it's not going to be. And clearly if we're thinking about things like planning and designing age-friendly homes and neighbourhoods, these are slow burn issues. They take 10, 20 years, and the argument of that therefore is we'd better start now. So health and wellbeing boards, local authorities and others having this focus and recognising how essential it is to support independence and delay frailty. Related to that, and you've picked up the message already, is maximising community support to support people to be independent in their own homes in later life is absolutely fundamental. This isn't some sort of trendy big society thing that we're being cynical about. We should be utterly serious about how we actually maximise community support and engagement to address this, which is where the germ of the idea under the big society was not daft. It's how we do it, because the thought that the state can do it is just clearly fanciful. And therefore, understanding the range of initiatives that are already going on, casserole clubs, fostering elderly neighbours, there's a range of different initiatives. Just tracking those, seeing which works, seeing which ones we should scale, is the sort of question we would be asking ourselves in the centre. And we would also be asking ourselves, how do we promote cross-sector collaboration and planning? Because clearly I've been saying that just looking at this in a housing silo or a social care silo won't be sufficient. One's got to be thinking about it holistically. How do we do that? How do we make it happen? In part, I'm told that the Better Care Funding Initiative, the bidding process, is already starting to push people to have those sort of conversations. And if it only does that, and it needs to do a lot more, that will be a great start. So in policy terms, a real question, how about do you stimulate, without telling people what to do, the sort of local working to address the needs and to develop local strategies? Because, as you can understand, increasing independence for our older population will be clearly socially desirable, but it's also going to be financially and fiscally essential. If we don't find non-public sector funded ways of doing this, as well as increasing public expenditure on this category of people, we will have more need and more misery. So let me race on, because I'm probably getting closer to time. We would also, I think, want therefore to look at what looks like good local strategies to try to get some understanding of whether we need more pilots to promote independence and how we then promote and seed those and track them. And then do we need a model evidence strategy of how to support independence? These are the sort of questions I'd like to leave with you and that I think that we in the centre may be reflecting ourselves. And clearly at national level, how do NHS England, the LGA, Solace, Public Health England, Association of Directors of Adult Social Services, etc., Housing LIN, how do they work together on this issue and to give some clear signals and support to their membership? Because it's going to be essential. Let me then switch to what probably many of you would prefer me to talk about, how we ensure more choice. The problem, I think, is that there appears to be a pretty weak supply of new purpose-built accommodation, whether affordable or private sector build. If you compare the data on the amount of purpose-built accommodation for older people with Australia or the States, vastly bigger percentages than we have. You know, we're about 1%, they're about 10+%. Now, they've got the land, you would say, haven't they? But also we must look underneath that argument to see why is it our society has produced such a small amount of more purpose-built accommodation in all its great range. Is that first, and clearly we are engaging in this question partly in reaction to Ready for Ageing, and I'll touch on the good ministerial round tables we have been having on this, and ministers have been convening. So, for the here and now, is there evidence of demand for such housing, or is it just very weak? Is there evidence of supply problems? Are there many frustrated downsizers? How do we assess the increased demand with more older people in the future? And are planners or local politicians failing to give a lead to this? These are questions rather than assertions. Another of my guilty past is I was a town planner once, but again, you'll not even trace that. So I can be rude about them. And I think in part, planners are culpable in not having addressed looking forward on the 10-year view of their society. Planners used to own population projections, their implications. I think they've got lost the plot into detailed development control at present, and they need to raise their eyes to the challenge and the opportunity for their profession on this. There we are. I've offended some more people with any luck. Are specialist house builders handicapped by planning and other factors, or are developers ducking this market because there are easy ways of making a return? Is DCLG addressing this? If we'd asked this question, I think a year ago, the answer would have been yes. If we ask it now, no. If we ask this question now, I think there's very strong signs that CLG are seriously engaged with this issue, and that's to be commended and welcomed. People say, is national guidance strong enough? But why would we expect that shouldn't we expect local authorities to own this issue themselves without being told to do it at national level? It's worrying if they have to be told to do it before they actually engage with it. And so I don't think even if we did change national guidance, and that might be nice, unless you've actually got local authorities and health and Boyd to address the issue themselves, it's going to be sufficient. And the question that we ended at the end of a recent round table that the Housing Minister convened, and it was great. He had Norman Lamb, the Social Care Minister, and he had Steve Webb, the Welfare Minister. So you had cross-government departments addressing this issue about housing and later life collectively. The question we ended with was, where do we want to be in 5 years' time in terms of the quantity and quality of new supply housing, and what do we need to do to get there? Which, to me, we aren't allowed to use the word strategy anymore. It's a bit rude. But that seemed to me that was the proper question for us all to be thinking about. And we're looking forward to seeing the research that CLG will be undertaking to inform some of the questions that I asked about what are the failures in supply and demand. So clearly there's big issues on trying to get the supply side moving and questions about whether the demand is there. I've not in the time been able to talk about equity release, but clearly I was signalling that don't just focus on new supply, focus on the elephant in the room, the increase in demand and need that's going to come from people living in mainstream housing. And I suppose sort of the go-away questions are, and I've said it already, what do I do myself to prepare for my own later life, to build my own resilience, to give thought to that question, because there's an enormous amount we can do that will increase our prospects of a good later life, and hallelujah, I can tell you it's wonderful. But secondly, thinking about what we're going to do with our organisations. If you accept the message that it is certain we'll have more older people, and that's to be celebrated, that we want later life to be a good time, as good as it's possible to be, how do we get our organisations to work with other organisations to address how we're going to support people and address those challenges and opportunities ourselves? Thank you.